They avoided announcing the pay reduction in any formal meeting that might have seemed too significant for discussion. Instead, they buried it deep within an HR memorandum, beneath ambiguous terms like budget optimization and compensation realignment. It appeared in the fourth paragraph of the second page, described as a quiet adjustment. My monthly salary was cut by $4,200. No discussion, no advance notice. Just a single sentence embedded in an automated message. It bore no relation to my work quality. My performance had actually just generated over $48 million in anticipated revenue. 6 major clients, multi-year implementations, all structured using the same framework I had developed carefully, methodically over months of dedicated effort. But figures don't always tell the complete story. What they perceived was a budget line item. What they desired was to reduce it. I reviewed the message 3 times. Then I surveyed my office. Nothing had physically changed, yet everything had fundamentally shifted. No one visited. No one telephoned. The corridor beyond my door remained silent. And that silence conveyed more than the message itself ever could. I understood its meaning. It signified that someone had determined I wasn't worth my cost. Not because my output had decreased, but because I had accomplished too much without requesting additional compensation. I had made the work appear effortless. I had made client management seem straightforward. I had resolved issues before they reached anyone else's attention. In doing so, I had removed myself from the crisis narrative. They had forgotten the difficulty involved. They had forgotten who maintained stability. So when the agreements were nearly finalized, when the risks had subsided and the contracts were almost executed, they decided I was expendable. That was the concept I read between the lines. Expendable. But what they failed to recognize was this. Those proposals didn't exist merely in the folders they duplicated or the presentations they forwarded. They existed in the judgments I made throughout the process. Without those judgments, all they possessed were documents, empty frameworks lacking timing, sequence, or rationale. They believed they could preserve a system while eliminating the person who created it. They were mistaken. I didn't respond. I didn't argue. I didn't request reconsideration. I simply recorded the date, cleared my schedule, and began documenting what belonged to me. The proposal methodology, the negotiation framework, the delivery phase sequence, the pre-approval arrangements, all developed during my personal time under no employment contract, using none of their internal systems. I knew what would happen next. They would transfer my materials to someone else and expect identical results. And that would be their fundamental error. Because while you can duplicate a file, delegate a conversation, or hand over documentation, you cannot transfer experience. And you cannot accelerate comprehension. What they were about to lose wasn't just an employee. It was the reason their system functioned. So I stepped aside. I observed as they celebrated saving $4,200 monthly, and I waited. 2 days following the salary reduction, a forwarded message appeared in my inbox. It hadn't been sent directly to me. My name appeared only within a previous conversation thread, buried among automatic replies and approvals. But the attachment immediately caught my attention. It was a copy of the Barnes proposal. The structure was mine. The logic, the slide sequence, even the language in the executive summary. But the author attribution had been modified. A junior associate, someone I had mentored quietly over the past year, now appeared as the project lead. I opened the document. The risk buffer had been removed. She had deleted the provision I had negotiated to protect our profit margins from Barnes' unpredictable delivery requirements. It had required 3 weeks of discussion to secure that clause. She eliminated it with a single click, likely assuming it was a formatting mistake. It wasn't her responsibility. No one had explained its origins. That was the issue. I opened my original version, the one I had created before the modifications, the one never submitted through company systems. It contained no corporate branding, just clear slides, color-coded annotations, small timestamps in the margins. These weren't presentation slides. They were memory aids. Each modification, each tonal shift from Barnes, each compromise, they were all preserved there. None of that context had been transferred when they removed me from the project. They had retained the final form of my work, but none of the underlying structure. Then, with practiced silence, they assigned it to someone who didn't understand which elements were critical. The internal update arrived that same day. Excellent execution, it stated. Final version submitted. Timeline accelerated. Client engagement led by cross-functional team. 3 names were listed. Mine wasn't among them. No acknowledgement, no footnote, not even a word of appreciation. I didn't react. I didn't respond. I simply reread it until the screen became slightly blurred, and I couldn't determine whether what I felt more strongly was disappointment or clarity. Then I opened the folder on my system labeled Templates Legacy. Inside were the authentic versions. Not appropriated. Not created with company resources. Simply mine. Authored during late hours. Built to protect both the client and the agreement from decisions exactly like the one they had just made. That night, I relocated the complete Barnes framework to a secure location. Not because I intended to use it, but because I needed to remember its true ownership, and they needed to discover what happens when you attempt to assign credit to someone who never shouldered the responsibility. There are certain folders that remain unopened. Not because they're restricted or concealed, but because their names suggest mundane content. Mine was labeled Templates Legacy. I had placed it in a shared directory years earlier, and no one had accessed it since. But within that folder existed a second version of every project I had ever developed. Not the polished ones. Not the branded documents with charts and logos. These were the working versions created during late nights, annotated with details that would never survive a design review. Margin notes, highlighted cells, delivery concerns that had been resolved through corridor conversations and vendor calls long after the office had emptied. The Barnes proposal had 12 versions stored there. The team had only seen 5. That folder existed because I had learned early that not everything worth preserving made it into the final draft. And in the type of work I performed, the part you overlooked was usually the most costly element. After they reassigned the deal to someone else, I knew they had only copied the external draft. They never requested context. Never asked what had been removed to simplify the timeline. They took what appeared ready and moved it forward, hoping the structure would hold. But it wouldn't, because they had eliminated the component that explained why each decision had been made. The revised version now sat on the client's desk, shorter, simpler, more streamlined, they claimed. But the implementation was now compressed into 2 phases instead of 3, a decision that ignored every concern Barnes had raised about internal security. That 3rd phase wasn't optional. It was a safeguard. I had spent months convincing them that rushing it would leave their systems vulnerable. That conversation had occurred informally over a delayed dinner after a missed flight. No presentation captured it, but it had shaped everything. And now it was gone. I reopened the original and transferred it to a private system, not stolen. I had built it outside work hours on my own equipment without using any company template. I had done this long before the salary cut because I had already learned that organizations like ours reward the result, not the method. They only see the building when it's completed, never the scaffolding that supported it. So I preserved the parts they didn't value. Not from vindictiveness. Out of respect for the work itself. Because I knew what would happen next. They would deliver that new version. The client would review it. They would pause, then ask a question. Not a major one. Just one small question that no one on the team would be able to answer. And when that silence arrived, it wouldn't be loud or dramatic. It would be quiet. It would be real. And I knew it would come by morning. The first call came at 8:14 a.m. I let it ring. It wasn't from the company. It was from Eric Barnes. In 18 months of negotiation, he had never called directly. Every exchange had followed protocol, scheduled emails, planned video conferences, carefully documented notes. But now, barely 2 days after they had submitted a new version of the proposal, he was calling without warning. That alone indicated something had gone wrong. I let the call pass, not because I had anything to conceal, but because I wanted to observe their response to my silence. 15 minutes later, his assistant's number appeared. This time I listened to the voicemail. Eric's voice was steady, but something lay beneath it, a tension he wasn't yet naming. Hi Nicole, I wanted to follow up on the new draft we received. There are a few sections that seem inconsistent with what we discussed. I just want to ensure we're aligned before we proceed. Let me know when you have a moment. I replayed that phrase. Before we proceed, which meant they hadn't signed yet, which meant there was still opportunity. I open my inbox and check the company's internal communications. No mention of concerns.
No escalasten.
Just congratulations on how quickly the team had delivered the final version. I read those lines 3 times. They still hadn't realized what was missing because the document they had submitted wasn't truly final. It appeared final, it had branding, numbers, the right format, but it lacked substance. It skipped the first phase entirely, the one that addressed internal controls, the one Eric had called non-negotiable during our initial meeting. They had removed it, shortened the delivery timeline, and renamed it a streamlined launch plan. It sounded efficient. It wasn't. At 11:07, another voicemail arrived. Shorter this time, less cordial. We're reviewing internally today. There are some inconsistencies we need clarified. If that phase was intentionally removed, I'll need to understand why. He had stopped asking. He had started demanding. I opened the last version I had sent him directly 4 months earlier. It was simple, unformatted, no design, but every note was there. Every risk addressed, every delay justified. Because I hadn't built that timeline to win a contract. I had built it to function. And now someone else had modified it to appear faster. I didn't call back. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I had already established everything months earlier. And if they wanted to erase my work, they would have to answer for the silence that replaced it. At 3:17 p.m., a single message appeared. No greeting, no introduction, just a line. Was this change part of your original plan? I stared at the question for a long time. Then I typed 3 words. I was removed. He read the message within seconds. The read receipt confirmed it, then nothing. No reply. No follow-up.
No acknowledgement.
But I understood what that meant. It meant the conversation had shifted. The doubt had landed. And now the burden was on their side. I didn't feel satisfaction. Just clarity. Because the truth had never been about recognition. It had always been about trust. And they had given that trust to someone who hadn't earned it. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday morning, 10:30 a.m. The Barnes team would review the revised implementation, confirm the adjusted scope, and finalize the agreement. They reserved a conference room, loaded the slides, and sent an internal calendar invitation titled Final Walkthrough, Barnes. I wasn't included, but someone forwarded it to me anyway. I opened the invitation, then closed it. I already knew how it would unfold. Barnes was never confrontational. They never rejected deals outright. That wasn't their approach. They asked questions, calm ones, precise ones. And when the answers didn't align, they waited. The silence was their rejection. And silence, as I had learned, could collapse more than a conference room. At 11:12 a.m., a message came through the back channel. Barnes asked if someone else had built the original timeline. No further details. I pictured the room, the slight pause, the exchanged glances between the junior lead and the executive sponsor, the realization that something was unraveling but not quickly enough to stop it cleanly. They had entered with the wrong tone, the wrong confidence. They had mistaken formatting for understanding, and now they were learning that a presentation without comprehension is not a proposal, it's a performance. And Barnes didn't purchase performances. At 2:08 p.m., I received a second message. Signature delayed. They want to review phase structure again. That was the moment I knew the deal wasn't just slipping, it was stalling. And the person they needed to move it forward, the one who understood the reasoning behind each decision, was no longer in the room. Because they had removed her quietly to save $4,200 per month. By that evening, the update stopped.
No announcement. No celebration.
No internal post about milestones achieved. Just a gap, a space where a signature should have been. And in that space, a silence that no team lead could explain. The message came early, before most people had arrived at their desks. It came from someone I barely recognized, a name I remembered from an orientation schedule, not a strategy meeting. The subject line was polite but uncertain. Quick review. Barnes' proposal adjusted. Attached was a new version of the proposal. They didn't ask for help directly, but the language was soft enough to reveal what they needed. Would you mind taking a quick look just to make sure we didn't miss anything important? I paused before opening it, not because I was hesitant, but because I already knew what I would find. The file was cleaner. The slides had been condensed. The implementation had been softened again, now repackaged into a simpler, more approachable format. It looked like something built by a team trying to sound confident rather than be confident. The firm's branding had been made more prominent, as if visual design could replace strategic alignment. Halfway through, I saw something that stopped me, a sentence I had written 6 months ago, pulled directly from a version that had never been shared with anyone outside the original call. They had copied it verbatim, but stripped of the context it once carried. It felt weightless. They had quoted the conclusion, but skipped the conversation that made it meaningful. Near the end, there was no signature page, just a placeholder that read, "Pending client confirmation." They were still hoping Barnes would sign, but it was no longer about the content. It was about the silence that followed every new version, a silence they had tried to fill with formatting and quick revisions, none of which addressed the gap Barnes had already sensed. Another message came later that morning, this time from someone higher up. The tone was more direct, the language tighter. "Let us know if you're available to assist." As if I had been waiting quietly on the sidelines, ready to fix what they had broken by cutting me loose. There was no mention of what had happened, no acknowledgement of the earlier decision. Just a request wrapped in convenience, hoping I wouldn't notice how little had changed. But I had noticed. And so had the client. So I replied calmly, briefly. "Thanks for including me. Unfortunately, I'm no longer assigned to this client. Wishing the team success moving forward." I didn't reopen the file. I didn't correct their draft. I didn't explain what had gone missing because I had already explained it once, and they had chosen not to listen. The first call came quietly. Not from Barnes, but from someone else, a procurement lead from a different account I had structured last spring. She left a message. Her tone was measured, but there was something beneath it, a hesitation that came not from confusion, but from concern. "Hi Nicole, I know you're probably no longer the point of contact, but I had a few questions about the sequencing we reviewed earlier. There's some new language we didn't expect in the updated proposal. Just hoping to clarify before we move forward." I didn't answer. I didn't return the call. Not because I was avoiding her, but because I had already made a choice. The structure had changed. I no longer stood between these clients and the consequences of what followed. Still, I played the message twice. She remembered not just the documents or the meetings. She remembered the tone, the pattern, the way each phase had once aligned with her concerns. Now something no longer fit. Over the next 3 days, more calls followed. None were angry. None were dramatic. They were worse than that. They were quiet. Quiet in the way disappointment settles. Quiet in the way people speak when they realize they may have trusted the wrong version of something. They all express the same concern in slightly different ways. "We just want to make sure nothing's been lost in the transition." But things had been lost. Not data, not files. What had been lost were the reasons behind the choices, the weight behind the sequence, the hours that turned assumptions into decisions. Because the people now leading these proposals were not the ones who built them. They were the ones who inherited them. And the clients could feel the difference. The message came late, not by the clock, but by the calendar, by the weight of all the silence that had preceded it. By the time it reached me, the things it might have salvaged were already beyond repair. It came from someone senior enough to avoid minor conversations, someone who hadn't spoken to me since the day they decided my salary needed adjustment. The subject line carried my name as if that alone might reopen something. Inside, the tone was gentle, respectful, almost rehearsed. "Hi Nicole, I hope this finds you well. We've been revisiting the Barnes implementation and would really value your perspective. If you're open to reconnecting, we'd love to discuss ways to re-engage you more directly on this and related work streams. Let us know what might work best for you." There was no mention of what had happened. No mention of the removal. No mention of the 3 internal proposals sent without my input. No mention of the file where my sentence had been lifted, used, and stripped of meaning. No mention of the $4,200 they had decided I wasn't worth. Only the word re-engage. I read it once, then again. Then I closed the laptop, because by the time they had reached out, I was already somewhere else. They had assumed I was still circling, still waiting, still connected to the system they had ridden me out of. But I wasn't circling. I was building. 2 weeks earlier, I had agreed to a different kind of conversation, one that began not with apology, but with clarity. Someone I had once worked with, an operations lead from a client account long closed, had reached out after hearing the Barnes deal had stalled. We met not in an office, not on video, just for a walk. No pitch, no offer. Only one question. What would you build if you didn't have to explain anything? And I knew the answer before I said it. It wasn't about control anymore. It was about building something that couldn't be erased with a line of budget mathematics. A framework that was mine, owned, defined, not tolerated for its usefulness, but respected for its origin. So when the old firm finally reached out, dressed in formality and calculated kindness, I saw it clearly for what it was. It wasn't a welcome back. It was an admission. They needed what they no longer understood. They wanted me to return to the system, but the system they referenced had already collapsed quietly. Not in one moment, but across many. A chain of decisions, each just small enough to ignore until the shape of what they had lost became too large to name. And now they were asking me to fix the surface while pretending the foundation was still intact. But I no longer lived at the surface, and I had no interest in returning to a structure that had once taught me silence was safer than ownership. I never replied to their message. Not because I wanted to make a point, but because there was nothing left to say. The distance between their need and my silence had already explained everything. They had asked if I could return to help realign the system, but the system they wanted help with was not one I recognized anymore. It had been hollowed out quietly in increments, and now they were asking me to come fix what they had broken in my absence. But I had already made my choice. By then, I was no longer part of their architecture. I had taken the only part of the work that ever mattered, the understanding. Not the documents, not the diagrams, not the templates someone else could fill in and reformat. I had taken the instinct that comes from watching decisions form over time, knowing which risks bend and which ones break. And I built something different. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I no longer believed I owed them anything. The new system started as a conversation. One client, one request. Nothing ambitious. Just someone I trusted asking, "Would you do this differently if you could start clean?" And I did. This time there were no departments to please, no budget lines to shrink, no middle managers adjusting metrics to justify a decision they didn't understand. There were only outcomes. And the people closest to the problem were the ones trusted to solve it. Slowly it grew. Not with headlines or hiring sprees, but with consistency, the kind that cannot be advertised, the kind that doesn't need explanation. One by one, the clients who had once spoken through account managers began reaching out directly. Not because of familiarity, but because they remembered how it felt when the system worked without fear. They didn't ask where I had gone. They asked how they could follow. That was when I knew I had built something real. Not because it carried my name, but because it didn't need to. The people who now worked beside me were not the ones who had stayed quiet when credit disappeared. They were the ones who understood that being overlooked is not the same as being replaceable. And in that shared understanding, we didn't talk about what we had lost. We built around what we refused to lose again. So when the old firm sent one last follow-up months later, offering collaboration on a limited basis, I didn't even open the message. Not out of bitterness, but because they still believed I might be waiting. I wasn't. The silence they were hearing was not protest. It was the sound of continuity. Without them, the strategy they thought they had minimized still lived, but not in their files, not in their systems. It lived in every decision I carried forward without ever needing to ask for permission again. The framework they had tried to minimize by cutting my salary had not disappeared. It had evolved. What they had seen as a cost to reduce, I had recognized as a foundation to build upon. The clients who had once communicated through their account managers now contacted me directly. The proposals that had once required committee approval now moved with the speed of clarity. And the understanding they had thought was transferable through copied files and forwarded emails lived on, not in their corporate systems, but in the decisions I made each day, freely, without needing to justify my worth to anyone who had already decided they knew my value better than I did. The silence that had once surrounded my removal had become the quiet confidence of ownership. What they had lost wasn't just an employee. What I had gained wasn't just independence. We had both discovered what happens when you mistake the person for the position, the creator for the creation. They learned that copying is not the same as understanding. I learned that my value was never dependent on their recognition of it. And in that mutual education, We had both found exactly what we deserved.